Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Reenactors Corner. In this episode number 2, we'll talk about how a changing political landscape will affect the hobby and what we can do about it.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I'm really excited to talk about some of the subjects that we're going to discuss here today. I think there's a lot to talk about. There's been a lot of controversies in reenacting over the last year or two. And so let's get to it. Lasse, how you doing today?
I'm doing just fine, I guess. And what about you?
I'm doing really good. It's a Friday night for me and looking forward to the weekend.
Well, I suppose it's Saturday morning right here.
Well, it's weekend time.
Yeah, absolutely. I was supposed to do an event this weekend, but it got cancelled.
I was supposed to be at a reenactment tonight, but the overnight part of the reenactment got canceled because of heavy rain all day today. And so we're going to be doing the reenactment tomorrow.
But rain is half of the fun, isn't it?
I like rain. I still wanted to go, but unfortunately, the actual thing that we're doing tomorrow is we're building these bunkers. It's going to be a lot of labor, a lot of physical work, and the guys in the group just decided that it was going to be a bad idea to have to set up our tent in the pouring rain, get soaked before the event even begins. And then tonight it's going to be cold temperatures. We were going to freeze. And the thought was that if we did that, then nobody was going to be in like a fit shape tomorrow to do difficult work. So we figured that showing up and being ready to work was more important than the kind of realism overnight part of it.
Yeah, whereas our event got cancelled because of just few participants, really.
Well, I guess we could both consider ourselves lucky that the events didn't get canceled because of some external political pressures, which is like part of what I wanted to talk about today. And it certainly happened to some other events in America, certainly.
Oh yeah, and this morning I actually got a call from the guy who runs the place we're supposed to reenact at, which is a coastal fort, and he said we couldn't do the event because of some political bullshit, but we had already canceled it. And what basically has happened is that the officials of that part of Norway has figured out that the fort is still a military property, so it has to be declassified until more activity can continue.
Wow, that's surprising.
Yeah, it was surprising to everyone because nobody thought it was still military.
Amazing.
So,
well,
yeah.
But it sounds like you'll be able to go back there again at some future time, hopefully, once they go through whatever paperwork they feel like they need to do.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think it'll just be like, hopefully just a few weeks.
Nice.
But you never know about paperwork.
Oh, yeah. And certainly, I don't know how it is in Norway, but anytime that the government or the military gets involved with something in the United States, it just drags on and on forever. And there's just no way to know when or if anything is ever going to get actually completed.
Yeah, I just hope that the officials will call the military and they'll be like, what, is that still military property? We haven't been using it since the 70s. And then it's declassified, hopefully, but you'll never know.
Well, I guess on that note, I just kind of want to launch into some of what I want to discuss today, which are some of the challenges that I think we really need to acknowledge as reenactors that we're faced with right now at this time. Now, I know you and I are going to have very different perspectives on this because you live in Europe. I live in the United States. Things are very different culturally, politically in these two areas. And so I may be faced with challenges that maybe you're not, or maybe I'm used to being able to do things that you haven't been able to do, or the other way around. But I'm sure that there are still a lot of things that affect all reenactors, regardless of where they live.
Yeah. So,
Um,
what's the first thing you want to bring up?
well, I guess I'll just kind of talk about how politics have changed in the United States since I've been doing this hobby over the last 20 years, and especially just in the last few years um, with the election of our president, Donald Trump. I think a lot of reenactors, look, there are reenactors that I know who are big fans of President Trump. There are reenactors that I know who absolutely hate President Trump and everything in between. But I think something that no one really predicted was that um, when President Trump got elected, it really energized people who were opposed to him, and it kind of emboldened them to resist. Is like the thing that people say, they're the resistance, and they are going to be opposed to anything that they associate, like consciously or subconsciously, with Donald Trump, and they're going to be vocal and aggressive in their opposition to that. Now, obviously, I don't think that there is no real connection, right, between Donald Trump and World War II reenacting. There's kind of this belief that a lot of people in America have, and that the media are kind of pushing. And, let's say maybe this is true, right? That President Trump's election somehow emboldened real Nazis, right? Real, like, white nationalists or whatever. And that white supremacists are committing more hate crimes than ever before. So it's created this really, really charged political atmosphere for anything that could be associated with Nazi at all. And I don't consider World War II reenacting really to have anything to do with, like, Nazi politics. It's about history. But the fact is that when you're wearing a uniform with a swastika on it, then to an outsider, in a lot of ways, in a lot of instances, they're going to have a reaction as if it's political. And because the political atmosphere in America has become so tense and so divided, I think it's just a lot harder to people make a judgment first. People are convinced that you're a Nazi before you even open your mouth, just on the basis of that you have this uniform, or you have this interest even. And so I think maybe we could think about that, and maybe we could think about that and think about ways that we could respond to this, not necessarily like in a public way, but within our own space, within our own community. I think we need to understand that people maybe aren't looking at us the same way here in America as they were a couple of years ago. And so maybe it would be better for us to decide to do some things differently and do things our way, instead of having those decisions made for us, which is happening to reenactors all over America as we speak.
And what do you suppose that could be?
Well, I'll give you some background on this. So another aspect of this, besides the election of Trump, has been this debate in America over what to do with Civil War monuments to the Confederacy, the Southern states, and the soldiers that fought for the South in the Civil War. And a lot of people believe that these Civil War monuments are monuments to white supremacy. They're oppressive white supremacist symbols. They're offensive, and so they need to come down and they need to be destroyed. And there's another side of this argument that says that these are important cultural monuments that have to do with the heritage and the sacrifices made by individual soldiers who, maybe weren't politically motivated, or maybe were fighting to defend their town or their friends or whatever. But the important takeaway from this is that you've got this, like, tense political battleground that is being waged over history and over historical symbols. So when we're looking at reenactment and the use of historical symbols, it's like we shouldn't be looking at this in a vacuum. We need to understand that this is something that is culturally very relevant right now. And another aspect that I wanted to touch on very briefly was Civil War reenacting. Civil War reenacting is facing a lot of pressure because people associate Civil War reenactors with the type of Civil War commemoration that includes the monuments that are so controversial now. And of course, there's this kind of link in the public consciousness. And I'm not saying that this is an undeserved link, right? But there's a link between the South in the Civil War and the people who fought for it and slaves and white supremacy in America. So that's reenactors, Civil War reenactors are facing a lot of blowback from that in America, and they are having events that are getting canceled. So, you know, what can we do? What can we do to make things easier for us? Well, I have some like really simple sort of answers. And then I think there are some like deeper sort of like meta-political approaches that you can take to it as well. So like the really easy stuff, right? Like I'll give you an example of something that I've done. So in my reenactment group, we generally do an impression that is kind of centered around 1942. And at that time, prior to August 1943, German army soldiers had a eagle decal on the helmet that has a swastika. And so you've got this helmet that has a shiny silver eagle and a swastika on the side. And then after 1943, they stopped putting that decal on there. So for when we do public displays, we try to get people to use the no decal helmet, just because any swastika that we can not use and without sacrificing historical authenticity, I mean, why not? You know, I'm not trying to provoke or anger spectators at these events. I'm trying to do something that is educational, and provoking them with swastikas that don't need to be there is not going to help. You know, another example is we wear the 2-pocket HBT uniform at public events, which doesn't have a breast eagle. You know, so again, it's fewer of the symbols. Now, I understand that there's still a swastika on my belt buckle, and there's still a swastika on my cap, you know, on my field cap, and I'm still portraying a soldier who fought for Hitler during the Nazi time. I'm not trying to mitigate that or take away from that. I'm just trying not to make that the emphasis, you know, and to put the emphasis in other places. So that's something that I would recommend that people do that I think is kind of easy.
But couldn't one use, for example, the subdued breast eagle to avoid?
Absolutely, I think that's a great idea. It's and I'll be honest. Years ago, I was in a group, and we used to do public events, and we would have a big like swastika flag on a flagpole. I look back on that, and it is insane to me that we did that, and it wasn't necessarily historically correct to do it. I mean, it was hokey. Okay, it was a cheesy thing, and it was kind of rooted in this almost like juvenile idea of like, okay, well, we're the Germans, we're going to have a German flag, and the Americans can have an American flag thing. But it's at the same time, it's kind of chilling to realize, okay, now. All right, so 15 years ago, flying a Nazi flag at a public display was something that I didn't think twice about, and now I can't believe that I did that. Well, what does that mean for 15 years from now? Am I going to be shocked, or you know, is it going to blow my mind to look back and remember a time that I was able to wear a World War II German uniform at a public event at all? You know, things are changing, things are progressing in this way. So. You know, our public event's going to go away. I'm just going to come out and say it. I think there's a chance that there might not be so much of a demand in the future for people dressed up as World War II German soldiers. You know, whether or not it's educational, however you feel about this, probably the majority of people in America at this time would strongly agree with the statement: wearing a Nazi uniform is not okay. And I don't blame them for feeling that way. And I'm not necessarily complaining about it. I just think it's really important that we reenactors are aware of this, because there's some denial out there. People will say, well, in my small town, everyone's a veteran, and we love our veterans, and military service is fine, and everyone has guns and no one cares. And it's like, all right, sure, but maybe that bubble is shrinking by the day and you don't realize it. or maybe that bubble isn't representative of what people are experiencing across even your own state or your own country or the world. So instead of burying our heads in the sand, I think it's better to see these changes, know that these things are changing, and try to get a sense of what the future holds. I mean, what is it like in Norway with the political situation? I know you don't have Civil War monuments, you don't have Trump. What do you think the trend is in Europe for this kind of commemoration?
Well, the thing here is that Norway is outside the European Union, so I'm not too familiar with, basically the rest of Europe. But right here, I would say, you need to be cautious, as with anything, but there's generally no problem with it in short terms. We don't fly big Nazi flags on public displays, but that's more or less because it's not really historically accurate at all. But we do not hide our swastikas or anything like that. We do have a public event host who doesn't want us to leave our camp in uniform because of the swastikas. But they also seem to be the only ones, and that event is shrinking massively every year.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
We've had some events like that too, public events where they've had a media presence there covering like maybe a ceremony with some American veterans, and they'll come over and they'll be like, hey, look, during this time period, can you guys please like just keep a low profile, and stay by your tent or whatever, which is okay. Part of like it's important to have a certain sensibility, I think, as a reenactor, as a World War II German reenactor. If you think, okay, well, there's nothing offensive about what I'm doing because I am not a Nazi, and I'm just doing this for history, so there's no reason why anybody should be upset if they see me or these symbols on my clothes. That's totally unreasonable. I think it's important to understand that you've got to kind of like be responsible about how you portray this stuff. You got to be responsible about how and where you use these symbols.
Yeah, and but I think one of the bigger parts about that specific event I was talking about is that it consists of older men, and I touched on this in the previous episode barely, but it seems that the generation that was born after World War II has seen the occupation force of Norway as being demonic, and like basically had the propaganda, the brainwashing that the Germans are really, really bad from their parents who lived during the occupation, and therefore they do not want us to be going around because they see it as offensive. But the interesting part here is that whenever we actually meet people who lived during the war and the generation after, those who don't like us, all of them seem to just like us. We've had people who come up and say that they lived during the occupation, it was a horrible time, they really hated it, but they love what we do.
That's really cool. Very, very different perspective from how things are in America. It's just, for me, it seems like the further we get from World War II, the more demonized and the more politicized World War II Germany becomes in the eyes of the American public. I think people are probably familiar with this like 1970s sitcom that we had in America called Hogan's Heroes. That's like a slapstick comedy about Americans in a Nazi prisoner of war camp. I mean, something like that. This came out before I was born, so I don't know how it was received, but I can't imagine that anything like that could ever be made today. The fact that there were like comic books that were popular in the 60s and 70s and TV shows that showed, with like cool drawings, right, of German soldiers and stuff. I don't see that kind of stuff at all anymore. I think it's just become so aggressively politicized that kind of like being a thing, you couldn't portray any of that stuff in a way that made it look cool. I don't think it would be possible to do that anymore.
It's interesting you bring up Hogan's Heroes, which is kind of like America's Allo Allo, if you're
Yeah.
familiar with that one. Because Norway is still producing like these cheap slapstick comedies based on World War II. Most recently was last winter. I suppose it was just before New Year's Eve. There was this really bad comedy sketch by some Norwegian comedians about how a German officer invented Viagra during the occupation of Norway.
Sounds terrible.
Yeah, it was, but like we still make slapstick humor of World War II. So I mean, the culture is just so different, I suppose.
It is so different. Well, it's changed so much in my time being a reenactor. The other day, I was going through some old papers and I found a newspaper from Lebanon, Pennsylvania, from like maybe 2005 or 2007 or something like that. And it was an article about the reenactment at Fort Indian Town Gap, the Battle of the Bulge reenactment. And it was like a very positive article about this event that happened and the veterans who were there. There were veterans who were interviewed, and I also was interviewed and quoted in the article. Now, fast forward 15 years or so, and the most recent time that I was interviewed by a reporter, a newspaper reporter, it was at an event in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I gave the guy a fake name. I told him that my name was Chris Johnson. And I'll tell you, I was really, really glad later that I had made that decision, because the article was absolutely scathing. I mean, it was basically an attack job on reenacting. And it's really unfortunate that it's possible, let's not sugarcoat it here. It's possible for a journalist to go to a reenactment event and find people who say the wrong thing, or they don't realize how their words can be interpreted, and so they come off sounding stupid, or they come off sounding tone deaf. And there were quotes like that in the article. So I mean, it's interesting to see that even in my own behavior, right? Like at one time, I was thrilled to talk to a reporter and use my real name, and was like proud to see my name in the paper. And now if a reporter comes, I'm going to lie. I'm going to give a fake name, because I don't want anybody to be able to do a Google search on my name and come up with that kind of stuff, come up with an article that's going to paint me as being a fool or a white supremacist.
That is, yeah, I can totally see it. I just think even that is kind of different here in Norway.
Sure, sounds different.
Yeah, part of the reason is that because Norway has a news media, or it's basically a broadcast company who also is one of the biggest news outlets in Norway, who are 100% funded by taxes. And because they're funded by taxes, there's also some extreme laws around them, and as well other journalists that prevent them from like painting people worse than they actually are.
Well, it's funny because in America, I think people would bristle at the suggestion that we could have like a state media, and instead say, well, we need to have a free independent press. But I think if you look at what this free independent press actually does here, I'm not convinced that it's a better system. But
yeah, from what I understand it, all American newspapers are basically owned by two different owners.
It's a weird situation, and I don't want to veer too much into modern politics, but look, from a reenacting perspective, I don't think that the media is my friend. I don't think that media coverage of what I do as a reenactor is ever really likely to be favorable. Now, there have been some articles and things that I've been a part of that came out good. There was I guess the National Travel Insurance Company, AAA, American Automobile Association. They have like a New England magazine for their members who live in the states where I live. And they had somebody come to an event, and he did a little article about a reenactment event that was in Vermont, and it was really positive. And it was kind of cool where if I wasn't already a reenactor and I saw that article, it made it look appealing, and maybe I would have wanted to get involved. So, I'm not saying that there can never be positive coverage, but on the whole, I feel like you got to be very, very careful, and I'm very, very suspicious of the motives of any journalist who wants to cover World War II reenacting, because the way things are with our society and how politicized everything is now, it's just so easy to paint it in a bad light. And something that I really believe is that right now in America, World War II reenactment can exist in part because most people don't know that it exists. I think if more people were aware of it, there would be more pressure against it. So that's something to think about too. But let's take, for example, something that affects everybody, regardless of where they live, which is this social media kind of quote unquote censorship, where you've got Facebook and to some extent also Instagram cracking down on historical reenactment related content. That's something that you and I have had problems with trying to run a discussion group on Facebook.
Yeah. We have basically run the famous Help Page 2.0 and the Help Page 3.0, as well as a few other offspring kind of pages too.
I got on Facebook many years ago when everybody got on Facebook, and I stayed away from any kind of reenactment discussion on there because I didn't want it to be something that people could associate with me. I didn't want, there are people in my life that I don't want to know that I do this stuff. And so I avoided all reenacting discussion on Facebook. But then there came a day, and this was probably, 6 years ago or something now, where there was a local event that happened not very far away from where I live, and I never even heard about it. I didn't hear about it until after it happened. And I talked to people and I said, I didn't know anything about this event. Why didn't I get the invite? And everyone said the same thing. They said, well, didn't you see the posts on Facebook? And I realized that I was out of the loop by refusing to participate in reenacting discussion on Facebook. The old communication tools that we had always had, people weren't going to be using those anymore. No one was going to be calling me on the telephone to ask me if I was going to be going to a reenactment. And so I made a reenactor-only Facebook account, which eventually came to basically be my primary main Facebook, because I don't like Facebook. And now the only reason why I'm on Facebook is to talk about World War II and World War II reenacting. But it's a weird situation, right? Because Facebook is really not well suited for having these kinds of discussions or for posting reenactment related information, because they've banned pictures of knives, pictures of guns, and of course swastikas and SS runes and anything that could be construed as Nazi. They're going to delete that, or they could delete it. They might delete it in this haphazard way that they're doing it. So it's not a very good platform for this. But the other side of the coin is that if we want to reach people who aren't already in the reenactment scene, we kind of have to have a presence on Facebook. So this is something that I really struggle with.
Yeah. I don't really look at the censorship on Facebook as a bad thing. Although it is a bad thing for the hobby. But at the same time, Facebook is losing footing because of some other major competitors. Now, it's important to remember that when Facebook came, it quickly gained popularity and basically crushed all the other competitors it had, mainly MySpace, for example. Can even remember those days. And
I loved MySpace. I miss it to this day. I have nostalgia for it.
yeah, and but like for many years, Facebook was basically all alone and the only provider of a social media platform where you could basically have groups and pages and friends and walls and such. You had Twitter from very early on, but it doesn't function the same way. It's a different kind of social media. So Facebook still was on the throne, but right now Facebook is actually losing many members to other competitors. For example, the Russian VK, I believe, and then you have the new MeWe, and you got Instagram, who many people actually go to instead of Facebook, and there's lots of people who actually go to Snapchat instead of Facebook as well, especially very young kids in not very young kids, but like 15, 16. I know several who are like, Facebook, no, I don't even have a user there, but I got Snapchat and Instagram.
Look, I know that Facebook, they've kind of got to do what they got to do, right? I'm not going to sit here and say that they should necessarily be allowing content that they think is hateful on their platform. And I understand that even though I don't mean it to be hateful when I post a photograph of some World War II helmet or something, that, somebody might perceive it as being hateful. I mean, this is our world now. I guess to me, I'm kind of struggling with that. I feel like I kind of our hobby has to have a presence somewhere where people are likely to find out about it if we want to get more people involved. But on the other side of the coin, I feel like more people knowing about it can be a negative too. If those people become hostile and are putting pressure on event sites to get events shut down, and the ultimate horror story that's happened to multiple people that I've talked to myself, where they got fired from their jobs because someone found out that they reenacted World War II and started putting pressure on their employers. This is not something that can't happen. This is something that is happening to people now. It has happened to people, and it's going to happen to more people. And I think we need to be really smart about this. So my strategy right now is, I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. I've got pictures of me wearing a World War II German uniform. But I am keeping that really, really separate from other aspects of my life and people who don't have to know about that sort of thing. And I also am trying to kind of make it so that there aren't things in my life that would be destroyed if it were to come out that I reenact World War II. And so part of that is, it's like making sure that people that I really, really don't want to know about this, making sure they don't find out about it. And then making sure that other people who can know about this do know about this, so they wouldn't be shocked or taken by surprise if someone said, well, do you know Chris Pittman? He reenacts World War II. It's like, yeah, I do. I know that he does that. And I'm not going to fire him for that, or I'm not going to stop talking to him. I'm not going to denounce him for that. So that's kind of something that I think that people should be thinking about. I mean, what do you think about kind of the public attitude in Norway and in Europe? Do you think that it would be better if more people knew about the World War II reenacting hobby, or do you think there would be more pressure if more people knew about it?
I think if more people knew about it, it would be less of a problem because most people are understanding. And it seems, at least, that here in Europe, there's still the attitude that if one hates it, it shouldn't be banned.
Sure.
But where, for me at least, it seems like in the USA, if one person goes and says that it really offends them, then people will actually take that seriously and do something about it, which isn't necessarily a bad thing when I say it out loud like that.
Well, it can manifest itself in a bad thing if you're trying to do something that is kind of outside the mainstream at all. And World War II reenacting is like way outside the mainstream. Um, then there's there's kind of a risk there. I mean, I didn't vote in the 2016 elections. I don't really vote in elections, but I was not miserable when the Democratic Party didn't get a lot of power in that election because of the gun laws that they advocate for. There's a lot of people on that side of the political spectrum who would want there to be gun laws that would make World War II reenacting more difficult, that would make my life more difficult. But the actual reality as it's played out is that somehow Trump and the Republicans have made my life as a reenactor more difficult by increasing the spotlight on right-wing anything or Nazism or these, however they want to frame it, things that don't really have anything to do with my reenacting endeavors, but that are definitely affecting it.
Yeah, as I've previously said, I think it's good that Facebook does take responsibility and start banning white supremacists and racists because it's a bad thing for society as a whole. And it seems more that our hobby is just the innocent bystander getting shot at in
Yeah,
this fight.
totally. It's not related to any of that stuff, but it's getting lumped in with stuff that it's not really connected to.
Yeah. So
But like
maybe
speaking of gun laws, what are the gun laws like in Norway?
constantly changing.
Sure, that we've got that too.
I mean, Norway is called the Texas of Europe because of our quite liberal gun laws, but it's still way more conservative than in the USA, of course. But actually, Norway has more registered firearms per citizen than the USA.
Wow.
Norway has a very long tradition of hunting and sport shooting. We even have an organization which is called the Volunteer Shooting Force, which was basically created 150 years ago to train sharpshooters, and in the event of an invasion, they would take arms and go out and shoot the enemy as civilians. And this is something they actually did when the Germans invaded as well. And
That's incredible.
so, I mean, there's quite few people who haven't shot a weapon in Norway, but still getting a weapon do require some, well, I wouldn't say lots of paperwork, but for any American, I suppose it's lots of paperwork.
Well, in America, every state is different. So, like the state where I live, it's practically impossible for me to get any kind of weapon. Whereas if I were to drive 1 hour north, I would be in a state where if I lived there, I could go buy military surplus rifles at the store with just by flashing my driver's license. So it's a very confusing system in America where it varies so much from state to state. And of course, when you're doing reenacting, for most reenactors, you're doing reenactments in other states, and those states have their own laws. And you may have to travel through other states to get to the states where the reenactments are. And those places have maybe contradictory laws too. You've got the same thing, and it's legal where you live and it's legal where you're going, but maybe it's illegal in a place that you have to pass through.
Yeah, we get that quite a lot while we're doing reenactment outside of Norway as well, which we do quite regularly. And it's also funny that you mentioned that the states vary a lot and that it's almost impossible in your state. I know in the New York, at least in the New York City area, it's almost illegal to own a gun.
Sure.
And it seems that many Europeans, at least Norwegians, seem to think that in America you get a shotgun when you sign up for a bank account at a bank and stuff like that, which I think has happened in some states. But when I tell them
There
that some
are,
states are actually more strict than Norway, they go like, "Nah, get out of here. That's not
yeah,
true."
it's there are cities and states where you basically can't get a weapon. Um, the laws have changed. The laws are changing all the time. For me, um, where I live, people have to have a special identification card to own a firearm, and that identification card is expensive and has to be renewed every few years. And in order to get it for the first time, you have to actually take what is called a hunter safety course. And then if you take the hunter safety course and you get that card, then you're allowed to own certain types of guns, but it's a very limited spectrum of guns. And if you want to buy a gun, there's like a waiting period. You can pay for the gun, but then you can't get it for like a week. And there's background checks, I think, every time you go to get a gun. And there's very, very many things that can disqualify you from owning a gun. If somebody files a restraining order against you, which is a thing that happens sometimes, sadly, in divorces when there's a custody battle. This is kind of a common thing that happens. The restraining order gets filed, you lose all your guns. If you're having a hard time and you go to a hospital and you say that you're having suicidal thoughts, the police can come to your house and take all your guns away, and you don't get them back. So it's complicated, and there's a lot of shades of gray, and it depends on where you go. It really is a lot more complex, I think, than people realize. But this can have a real problem with reenacting. The longest running World War II tactical reenactment in America that I know of is in Odessa, New York, and they have a battle there every year. Lately, it's for the last 10 years or something, they've had a Western Front one and an Eastern Front one each year. And they've been having that event since the 90s, if not before. And that event is in New York State. And there was, after one of our horrific mass shooting events that happened several years ago, New York State passed what is called the SAFE Act, which was a series of new laws that are supposed to be aimed towards assault rifles, but that really affect a lot of types of weapons that people would use in World War II reenacting. And that event in Odessa has suffered tremendously. It suffered a really sad decline in numbers of attendees. And I think probably the number one reason for that decline in numbers is that SAFE Act, because people are afraid to go to New York. Even if their guns that they have aren't actually illegal under the SAFE Act, they're just so worried about these laws, and they don't understand them, and the laws are too confusing. So they'd rather just stay home than find out what's legal or what's not legal, or deal with it. So these gun laws, when they change, it can really have a definite impact on events.
Yeah, definitely. Norway did have a mass shooting back in 2011 as well. The only mass shooting Norway ever had, well, at least since the war, where 70 people were shot and killed. It's quite a famous incident.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that. I'm
yeah.
sure I have to think, were you, so you were a reenactor back then, were you?
I barely started around that time.
I got to think that people, if there were reenactors in Norway, they must have been faced with some pressure in the aftermath of that.
Well, I'm not really too sure, because I think people can see the difference, at least in Norway, of a lunatic compared to a reenactor.
Well, I'll say from my experience here in the U.S. in 2017, in August, there was that right-wing march in Charlottesville, North Carolina, where a woman was hit and killed by a car. And the pressure that happened to reenactors in the aftermath of that was terrible. I remember hearing about it on the news, seeing that a woman had been hit by a car, and I was absolutely sick to my stomach. I mean, it was a sad story. This woman died, and that it was really sad. but I knew that it was going to have consequences for me. It was going to affect me and my life, and it did. I had stuff that started to disappear from social media. I kind of had to take a little bit of a low profile after that, and there are events that I used to do here in New England that we don't have anymore, and none of these local events, no one ever said, well, we're not going to have events anymore because we're afraid about the negative publicity. But I know that has been a factor. I know that that's something that goes through the minds of these event organizers.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of glad that we don't really have that issue here. And
I wish we didn't. Yeah, I'm jealous that you don't have that.
yeah, and I'm starting to wonder maybe it's because of gun culture as well.
I think there's a lot of cultural aspects of it. I think there's demographic aspects of it. Some of it I think has to do with the media in the United States, as we discussed. They really want, they seem to really be trying to make people feel afraid. They're trying to weaponize historical concepts, and it puts us as reenactors right in the center of this weird political fight where we don't want to be taking a side, and maybe shouldn't be taking a side. And yet, we also can't pretend that it's 10 years ago or 20 years ago and these things aren't going to affect us. These things are going to continue to affect us going forwards. And like public events that I go to now, oftentimes they're billed as being for the veterans. And there are World War II veterans that attend these public events, and they're honored in various ways and celebrated. But it's very sad, and it's kind of scary to me to know that time is going to be coming to an end soon. It'll be many years still, decades probably, before the very, very last World War II veteran dies. But the time when these men are going to be like attending these events in serious numbers, it's going to be coming to an end really soon. And so when the veterans are gone, are the events that are for the veterans, are these events going to stop? The things people do that they say they do for veterans, are they going to stop doing them? I think that to some extent, veterans get used maybe inappropriately as a justification when in reality people are doing things because they want to or because it's fun. Let's be honest. I think there are better ways to help elderly veterans than dressing up like them and pretending to kill each other.
Yeah. Like the reenactment scene in Norway, at least, is quite small, and none of us do this to honor the veterans per se.
I love that about because look, I have respect for people who lived through adversity. I have respect for the history that these people were eyewitnesses to.
Absolutely.
I've spent a lot of time talking to these people, but look, I don't reenact to help them. I don't necessarily think that reenacting is the best way even to preserve these people's stories or memories. I mean, if I wanted to preserve their memories, I would maybe tape record an interview with them. I'm not going to dress up like them and then tell tourists their stories after they're gone. To me, that doesn't really make a lot of sense.
No. There's also the public battles where you got 40 Germans laying in some short grass field and just popping blanks at 40 Americans 10 yards away doing the same thing.
The public battles are something that we could maybe even do a future whole episode about. I've taken a stance against public battles. I won't do them. My unit will not participate in public battles, and although some members of my unit might go to events at which public battles happen, or maybe even would participate in public battles with other units that they're in, our unit as a unit will never do a public battle because I don't think that they're educational. I don't think that they're a good way to teach people about history. I don't think they're realistic for participants or for the spectators. like I say, I could go on and on about this, but public events as a whole, I think we need to really scrutinize and think, do we need public events to legitimize what we do as educational? Or can we say we do a private event, take photographs of it, document what we do, and share that on the internet? Is that maybe educational? Because if we need public events, I think we're going to be in big trouble if public events start going away. And already Civil War reenacting public events are facing a lot of pressure, and several of them have been canceled. And World War II events are going to be faced with that kind of pressure too. There are going to be people who are going to be asking, why is it family entertainment to go and see these people who are dressed in Nazi uniforms? That's what they'll say. And I think that's something that in the future is really important for all reenactors to kind of think about and be aware about, to be aware of the possibility that negative public reactions to public events could change how public events look in the future. And that if you're basing kind of a justification of this hobby on, well, look, I do public events, so I'm an educator and that's why I do it. Well, if there's no public event for you to go to, then you're going to be in trouble if you want to keep doing this.
Yeah, and I mean, there's plenty of other different hobbies that are quite similar to ours who doesn't even do public events. For example, let's look at live action role playing. That is something totally different, but in the base concept, it's pretty much exactly what we do. And they don't have any public LARP events.
No, they're doing it for them, and I'll be honest, and this probably won't come as a surprise to anyone who's seen my Facebook posts or who knows what I'm about, but look, I'm not doing this for the purposes of educating the public, and I'm not doing this to honor veterans of World War II. I am doing this because I think it is fun. It is a hobby that I like to do. It's educational for me. It gives me perspective, and I enjoy it. And I intend to keep doing this hobby for as long as I'm physically able to, regardless of political realities. I almost on some level would be okay with a more widespread, even negative public view of reenacting, because I'm still going to do it and it's not going to affect me having a good time. There are plenty of pastimes like being in an outlaw biker crowd or a militia or something like that, where the average person on the street is going to have a very negative view of it, and yet the people who do this stuff don't have a problem finding other people who want to do it with them because it appeals to a certain type of person, just like I think reenacting appeals to a certain type of person, not like the same type of person that maybe wants to be in the outlaw gang, I don't know, maybe, but I think there will always be people who want to do this regardless of the mainstream kind of political view of what we do.
I absolutely agree to that. And talking about educating the public, our goal isn't really to educate the public either. We're doing it for ourselves, but we are actually developing some concepts on how we could actually go, not necessarily to schools, but get classes outside so we can educate them. And that
sounds cool. I have a lot of respect for people who are able to do this in a way that is educational or contributes to the historical record. There are some reenactors that I am friends with on Facebook, some reenactors that I'm friends with on real life who are active in kind of academia in a way, doing real research and doing lectures or things like that, and I think that's fantastic, and I think that's something that all reenactors should aspire to do that if they can.
But there's also so many reenactors who for one doesn't really have any clue on history, and second doesn't really know how to teach.
Yeah, I think the first part of that is the real big problem, because I think people theoretically reenactment groups could have a framework that would empower their members to be able to be teachers in a sense. But if these people don't know the basic historical information, or worse, if they're touting some kind of ahistorical or revisionist type nonsense, which is a thing that happens, there are people who get involved in that kind of thing. Um, I think it can be really dangerous. Part of me feels like reenactors, yeah, it's a double-edged sword. I really do think reenactors should aspire to do it if they can, but I think a lot of reenactors can't and are never going to be able to, and like shouldn't.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest problems is that to do reenactment, you need to study details, and details aren't relevant to teach.
Right. I mean,
If I go to a school and say, this is the MG42, it has a firing rate of 1,400 rounds a minute, and it fires the 7.92 by 54 millimeter round. And it's like, what are you actually teaching the students with that information?
I totally agree.
You could rather actually go to the construction of the MG42 by saying that it's stamped sheet metal to save time because Germany was running out of time and workers, and they also dropped some aluminium parts because aluminium was fully reserved to plane production. And this would kind of put the war in a perspective that Germany was struggling. But by saying how fast a bullet goes out of the muzzle, it is totally irrelevant.
I think that's a fantastic point. I often think about a passage in a book called War Games by, I think her name, I can't remember this woman's name. It's a book about 20th century war reenactors, and it's kind of dated now, but there's a part in there where she describes a public display set up by an American group, reenactment group. And they have every type of shelter half that the American Army used during World War II was on display at this event. So you could see every variation of different type of shelter half. But of course, the author of this book asks rhetorically, what does seeing every type of shelter half teach anybody about what World War II meant or why it was fought? And it's like, we get so lost, I think, in this material culture stuff that we lose sight of this bigger picture historical stuff. I mean, look, I admit there are areas of history that I am shakier on than I should be. I'll give you an example is like the geography of the Eastern Front, where the various cities were, where the battles took place in relation to national boundaries from before World War II, from after World War II. I mean, this is a complicated subject. And if I had to plot all of this stuff on a map, I don't think I could do a fantastic job with a lot of aspects of it. So yeah, there's always more to learn. And it's tough to try to put yourself out there as a teacher when really you're always going to be a student. I learn something new about this stuff every day. And I'm not convinced that I should be a guy up there. What are my credentials? I don't have any credentials. I actually think that it's possible for somebody to be a really, really good reenactor without having a very good grasp on big picture history at all.
Yeah. And that's why reenactors shouldn't automatically educate the public.
Totally. It's I've known some reenactors who I thought were really, really good reenactors, perfect kits, who had a great attitude, who were a lot of fun, who had a lot of skills, but who maybe never read a book about World War II ever. And it sounds crazy to say that because you would think that a guy like that would want to have the information, but people learn in different ways. People have different interests, focused, and they will participate in their hobby in an infinite number of different ways.
Yeah, I mean, many of the reenactors who are in the hobby to basically pop off blanks would necessarily know of all the major events during World War II, apart from what I've seen in movies.
Yeah, and even to some extent, you can even read a lot of books without ever scratching the surface of some of this big picture historical information. I mean, um, when I got started in reenacting, I read a lot of memoirs of people who had been German soldiers in World War II. And I got a lot of information out of those memoirs that I was able to apply to my impression. And I would recommend reading memoirs like that to anyone who wants to be a reenactor or who wants to understand more what it was like to be a soldier during wartime. Um, but at the same time, there's the whole geopolitical aspect of World War II, the bigger picture, why it was fought, the competing world interests at play. That's never you're never going to read about that in the memoir of one person who's talking about what kind of food he ate.
Yeah.
So I think it's good to try to be more well rounded. But the thing is, there's so much to learn. It can be really daunting. And I think maybe something that we can try to do as amateur historians is try to maybe identify areas where we don't have a well-rounded enough understanding in our own space, in our own community, and try to address that. Maybe instead of aggressive posturing on Facebook about who made your M43 cap, maybe sharing some information about a book or just sharing some historical information, kind of at all. So it might be more helpful, something to think about.
Yeah, I think my biggest hole in World War II history is the North African campaign. Because I mean, if you give me a map, I can point out like Tobruk and El Alamein and all of that stuff, but I can't really tell you in which direction they fought at what year and stuff like that.
Well, that's the same for me. I kind of realized a long time ago that my life is going to have a limited timeline and that I can't know everything about everything. So there are like whole sections of information that I kind of never really delved into. And for me, North Africa is one of those things too. It's not something that I'm interested in from a collecting perspective. It's not something I'm interested in from a reenacting perspective. And so I've invested most of my effort into learning about other areas of World War II. And that's not to say that North Africa wasn't interesting or important. But you can't, it's so hard to know everything. It's so hard to have all of the information at hand all the time. It's such a big subject. That's kind of one of the things I like about World War II. It's you could make a whole hobby out of studying some battle or some combat action that very, very few people have ever heard of. It's all about if you have a niche interest like that, following it up and doing the reading, doing the work.
Yeah, and I think I need to correct myself because I wasn't even thinking of the Pacific, which is probably my biggest hole. Because I just totally forgot that even exists.
Right. And that's kind of interesting from my perspective because, as I mentioned in a previous episode, my grandfather was an American soldier in the Pacific. And when I grew up, I knew a lot of people who were veterans of the Pacific. And I heard their stories and saw their souvenirs. It's interesting, like from a reenacting perspective, that doesn't really get a lot of attention. And maybe it would be interesting to talk about that at some future time and why World War II reenacting is so dominated by the European theater.
Yeah, especially the Western Front post June in 1944.
Well, that's like kind of like the ultimate meme, is Western Front 1944. And I think reenacting is expanding a lot in terms of what people are capable of doing. I see a lot, obviously, I think all of us have seen a huge rise in recent times in interest in the Eastern Front. So I'm optimistic about what the future holds. You know, it's not impossible that maybe someday there will be Pacific theater reenactments that have hundreds and hundreds of participants. You know, I would love to see that. I wouldn't, but I wouldn't go. Wouldn't, you know? It wouldn't be a place for me.
Yeah, I doubt you would ever see it in Europe, to be honest.
Sure. I mean, do they do it in Asia? I mean, I'm sure they do.
They do actually. There's actually a unit in, I can't remember the name, but there's a Japanese unit who actually portray Americans.
That's cool. Good for them.
From what I've seen, they're actually doing it quite well as well.
I've seen a lot of Asian reenactors who do World War II German impressions with a very, very high level of skill. And I'm sure that they could do Americans in a way that would do justice to the history, and you know, maybe even be inspirational to American reenactors in America to up their game.
Yeah. But to backtrace a little bit back to the gun laws, because you were talking about differences in the states, and I would just like to touch on the differences we experience when we're reenacting outside of Norway.
Sure.
Because, all right, Norway has its gun laws, and because not necessarily just of the gun laws, but also because we lack any opponents, most of our events are non-blank shooting events. So lots of our members don't have the license to own guns, so they own deactivated guns, because in Norway, a deactivated gun is basically a chair in the law's eyes. You don't need any license for it, and you don't need any paperwork for it. It's just an item. But if we're to travel to reenactment in Sweden, deactivated guns are... You both need a license for deactivated guns in Sweden, and you also need paperwork for it. I mean, we could get past the license and go into Sweden, just tell the customs we're coming in with some deactivated guns, and we don't need a license in our home country, so because of the cooperation Norway and Sweden does, that is okay. But our guns doesn't have the paperwork, so we can't do it. So we actually, most of our members will own deactivated K98s because they are the cheapest in the world in Norway. They're basically $150 for a deactivated K98 because Norway basically got couple 100,000 of them in May 1945. So there's still around a lot of them. So buying, for example, a Danix K98, which would be legal to go to Sweden with, is actually more expensive than the real steel deactivated one.
Wow.
So whenever we go to Sweden, we actually need to borrow Danix and stuff over there.
Wild.
But
a lot of hoops to jump through.
Yeah, but Norway has two kinds of guns. It's the live guns and the deactivated guns. We do not have any section for blank firing non-guns. If the gun cycles, it's live. If it doesn't cycle, it's not a gun. But in Sweden, they have special rules for blank firing guns, and Norway lacks that. Most European countries do actually have blank firing guns, but Norway does not. So we always have to use live rifles and get the paperwork for a live weapon.
It's frustrating because you know that there are reasons for like these laws that have nothing to do with World War II reenacting, and we're just like affected by these laws that are responses to factors that are like totally not related to what we do. But there's never going to be enough of us to kind of force there to be an exemption You know, like if only it would just somehow have stated in a law at some point, you know, well, for people who are there for legitimate World War II reenactment purposes or something, you know, we're going to have this category of thing. And you can get a World War II reenactment license, you know,
Yeah.
but it's never going to happen.
In the UK, they do actually have a reenactor's license for live K98s or live bolt-action rifles,
That's
and
really
that
cool.
is fantastic. It's very difficult to get it and very time-consuming, but it's possible. And we, in my unit, are actually trying to conceptualize a plan to actually take this to the political level to get a new gun law in, which would make it easier for us to do stuff.
I love that idea. That's really exciting.
Yeah, but
You know, I wish you luck with it.
thank you. I hope maybe in 20 years we'll have something.
Well, it's cool. It's kind of a cool aspect of World War II reenacting is that reenactors do kind of support each other and help each other out and kind of help each other to kind of get around these, you know, rules. Like you're able to borrow rifles, and that's something that I like about reenacting.
Yeah, the reenactment groups we reenact with are super helpful. Absolutely. Now, back 1.5 years ago, we reenacted in Normandy in France. Now, France have their own weapon laws. We were renting weapons there, so that wasn't an issue. But suddenly, France do not allow gas masks, and gas masks are basically illegal in France, and this is because of there are many riots in France, and the police want tear gas to be effective.
Wow.
So we can't bring gas masks. So yeah, we could finally put Gatorade bottles in our gas mask cans.
Oh man, so weird.
Yeah. So I mean, there's lots of problems there. Also, when you were talking about events, I do believe further down on the continental part of Europe, Belgium, Netherlands, France, Germany, they have their issues with political correctness and the public's opinion. You also have the UK, who have basically banned German reenactors from certain events. But we are going to an event in Belgium in August, and it has apparently taken a lot of time to get all the permits needed, basically because it is World War II reenactment. And it was difficult enough to get permits for just American reenactments or reenactors, not even mention German ones.
Sure. Yeah, I can only imagine the type of red tape that you must have had to jump through with that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And it's really sad. In the UK, everybody knows what living history is because it's rather big. You also have the hobby wargaming, which is also big in the UK. Everybody knows of it, and most people there also know living history. It's more like everybody knows of it. So, for many of my British friends, it was kind of shocking when events suddenly started banning German reenactors specifically from their events.
We haven't seen very much of that in America, but I really believe that it's only a matter of, you know, and that's part of my idea about what my unit is going to do in the future is that we're going to do more events that are just immersion events on our own terms that are just for us. And part of the reason for that, probably most of the reason for that, is because those are the events that I like to do. But another part of the reason is just I just am really concerned with the way things are going about the future of public events. And I don't know how public events are going to continue, especially, like I say, is with fewer World War II veterans around. You're not going to have politicians who are going to want to stand up and be pro World War II German reenacting. Like that's almost certainly not going to happen. Everyone is going to disavow. Everyone is going to condemn what we do. It's the writing's on the wall. It's not a matter of doom and gloom, and I'm not trying to complain about this stuff. I understand the reasons why, and I'm talking about it. I'm not griping about it. Like I just, it is what it is, and I think we need to just accept it. And I think we need to before you can accept it, you have to be aware of it, and that's kind of what I'm hoping to do is raise some awareness. Like, hey, like things are changing now, and they're going to continue to change, and better to be ready for it than to be caught unexpected.
Yeah, and I think many people try to avoid change because, well, humans don't like change. So
Sure.
they may look at any change, even positive change, as a bad thing because it is different than how they're used to it being, basically.
Yeah, well, the people who are going to kick and scream and want reenacting to be the same forever, those people aren't going to be successful in the end because nothing stays the same, and it's better to be ready for the change. That I guess is my big point here for this whole episode. Whatever people think about the political pressures that are affecting us, I just think it's important to acknowledge that they are there, they are real, and they're going to continue to evolve and change. And we need to kind of think on our feet and be willing to make the changes that we're going to have to make.
Yeah, there's really nothing to add to that, I guess.
Cool. Well, I think we're kind of running out of time on this episode now, are we?
Yeah.
Well, good timing then, I guess.
Yeah, we're yeah.
So, well, let's close it out. And I guess we'll talk again soon. We'll do another episode soon. It's been fun, and I think we covered a lot of information today, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yeah, the hour really went by real quick.
Sure. Let's hope we didn't talk our ears off the audience too bad,
Yeah, and talk about the audience. It would be very kind of any of you listeners to give the podcast some positive reviews. Spread the podcast information to anyone you may think want to listen to it, because word of mouth is really the only way to, I guess. There's no use in advertising this podcast. So word of mouth is pretty important, I guess.
At some point, we should have like a website address that we could direct people to where they can ask us questions, people who might not know how to get in touch with us. But we could deal with that later.
Yeah, we need a little questionnaire episode as well.
Yeah, I'd love to hear some feedback from people, and I know that there are people listening to this who maybe know me through Facebook or Instagram, and certainly I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, and any questions that you have. We would love to take those too.
Yeah. So from the Reenactors Corner, I think it's time to get up out of the chair and go home.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for listening, everybody. Lasse, I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah. Goodbye.
Bye.